Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Assalatu wassalamu ala anbiya'il mursalin. Allahumma salli ala sayidina Muhammad fatih lima khuliq wal khatim lima sabaq nasrul haq bi haq wa hadila siratal mustaqim wa ala alihi haqdaril azim. Alhamdulillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh everyone wherever you are. May peace be upon you. We pray that you are in good health and good iman and well-being. Welcome to another night of Sawilahi and also podcast. And tonight we have three special guests, three blessed people that I know in my life. And we're going to talk about Shaykh Ahmad Tijani and the Tijaniyya Sufi order. So let us welcome our three guests. While we're waiting for another one, Sidi Talut, we welcome first Shaykh Zachary Wright and Sidi Ibrahim Dimson. MashaAllah. So Shaykh Zachary Wright wrote a lot of books actually. He's mashallah. And Sidi Ibrahim Dimson is the founder of Faida Books, and he also had published quite number of tariqa Tijaniyya books. Mashallah, may Allah preserve them. And I first know Shaykh Zachary Wright through his book on the path of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and that book actually changed my not only mine but also my wife and my life and how we see tariqa, how we see Sufi order. And recently also he has came out with a new book called Realizing Islam and about Tijani in the North Africa experience. So, Assalamualaikum, Sheikh Zachary, how are you?
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's an honor to be with you, Sidi Khaled. Honored to see you, Sidi Ibrahim.
Inshallah. Welcome to our program and our podcast. So, Sheikh, the first question I'd like to ask you about this realizing Islam, how different it is from the book that you had written on the path of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Yeah, so, as you know, the first book on the path of the Prophet was my master's thesis that I wrote in 2003. And I stand by it being a good introduction to the primary source material, and kind of an introduction to the biography. Hello, Imam Talut, how are you?
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Oh, welcome.
MashaAllah.
So I'm just
Inshallah.
answering the question about how the new book, Realizing Islam, is different than the first book, on the path of the Prophet. Um, and so the answer is that they're, of course, about a similar subject,
Mm-hmm.
but in reality, this book is much deeper, um, in delving into the primary sources, also looking at a wider range of secondary source material. There's been a lot of new research done on the 18th century, since I wrote my MA thesis, that I wanted to kind of respond to and situate the Tijaniyya within that broader intellectual context. And there's also been a lot of new publications in Arabic of
Mm-hmm.
Tijani primary source material. And so successive trips to Morocco have really been able to allow me to kind of put that together. I also had access to sources external to the Tijaniyya that speak about Shaykh Ahmad Tijani and 18th century intellectual developments in Morocco that I didn't look at previously, like Salawat al-Anfas by Sidi Jafar al-Katani. Very important sources about what was going on in Morocco in that time. And that also coupled with so new publications in Arabic, new ability, frankly, for me to look at those sources also. Arabic's got a bit stronger since almost 20 years ago. And new publications in 18th century, but also new manuscript sources, stuff that's been unpublished that I think really is important to speak to the maqam, or the spiritual station of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. As you know, the Jawahir al-Ma'ani is essential, but it doesn't really elaborate on the maqam of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani as Qutb al-Maktoum, because that was a maqam technically that he received after the completion of Jawahir al-Ma'ani. And although other writers like Sidi Arabi ibn Sa'i and the Bugyat al-Mustafi does elaborate on that subject, and Shaykh Ibrahim, of course, does too. There are other manuscript sources that do talk about what that firsthand accounts of that were written during Shaykh Ahmad Tijani's own life. So I took permission from Shaykh Tijani Sisi to put some of those passages in the new book. So that's where it stands. Frankly, there's no comparison between the old and the new books. From my own perspective, I mean, I think the first one is still a good introduction, but um, it, it deserved a follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sheikh. There's some questions from the audience. I think, mashallah, tonight we have quite a huge number of people viewing it. So I think Sheikh or Sidi Imam Talut or Sidi Ibrahim would like to share also about the biography of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, a new introduction to all those people watching, and they would like to know more about him. Maybe one of you, or maybe Sheikh, we can start with Sheikh Zachary right first, and then the rest can continue with his biography, life, and contribution first. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, first, I mean, I got to send my shout outs to Sidi Ibrahim and to you, Khaled. I didn't get a chance to properly greet Imam Talut and his work on the translation of the Jawahir Ramani. Really honored to be
Allah.
discussing this with him. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. Of course, this is the most important primary source about the life of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani.
Yeah.
So in terms of the biography that I can speak to as I'm trained as a historian, like an intellectual historian. Um, and I wanted to do a couple of things with my new book. And, so one was to sort of look into the references in the Jawahir al-Mani and other, like the Kitab al-Jami and other places where Shaykh Ahmad Tijani mentions different people that he met. And I wanted to be able to explore and nail down who those people were, what kind of intellectual currents were they connected to. And then I also, because I'm trained more as an African historian, and of
Inshallah.
course the Tijaniyya is, one out of every four Muslims in the world are on the African continent. The majority, according to the Pew Research polls, et cetera, of Muslims in Africa practice a form of Sufism. And by far the largest Sufi order on the African continent is the Tijaniyya. So the Tijaniyya is very important, a very important window into African intellectual contributions. And I felt that there wasn't a proper understanding in prior academic research about how the Tijaniyya spread into sub-Saharan so-called Black Africa, right? It's sort of like, well, I felt like the previous understanding was that, well, the Tijaniyya is a specifically heterodox Sufi order, and Black African Muslims are not real Muslims anyway. So of course they adopted the Tijaniyya. I really wanted to, tear apart that argument. And one of the ways I wanted to do that was to look at the sort of intellectual trends within West Africa in particular that predated and were right around the same time as the emergence of the Tijaniyya, and talk about how they had scholars in Timbuktu and other places that actually prefigured or had thought about a lot of the same ideas that the Tijaniyya were speaking about. And one of the most interesting connections I found, for example, was that the sort of pearl of the Tijani litanies is this prayer called Salatul Fatih that you opened this session with. This was the result of the spiritual inspiration of a sheikh in Egypt named Muhammad al-Bakri, who dies in 1585. And he had a relationship with the scholars of Timbuktu. They used to call him the Qutb. And in the Timbuktu Chronicles, he appears actually in Timbuktu in some of the mosques. And so we don't know whether he traveled by spiritually or actually went there. But they don't talk about Salatul Fatih. So that the idea then that the Tijaniyya has Muhammad al-Bakri's most important secret, and then and sort of brings it into West Africa, where people would already have been made aware of how important Muhammad al-Bakri was, for example, and and so they would have felt, they would have felt themselves part of a conversation that they had started long ago. And not to mention, there are things called like the tariqa Mahmudiyya, very similar iterations to the tariqa Muhammadiyya that are in West Africa from, from the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Um, and so in that way, this idea of combining, very orthodox practice of the Sharia with a form of Sufism, a Mohammedan Sufism that's connected to the person of the Prophet. This was the way that West Africans understood their religious identity, large, in a more broad fashion, but in more particular terms, and how they understood the practice of tasawwuf or Sufism. And so the Tijaniyya really, really resonated with those ideas that were already there in West Africa. And so, just very quickly, there are other kind of intellectual traditions that I'm connecting the Tijaniyya to. This is through the primary source material that Imam Talut has translated in others, but the the school of Ibrahim Qurani established in the Hijaz, and so the initiators like Muhammad Saman that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani met in Medina Munawwara, he was a part of this school. So what's interesting is that he was a student of Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi, who was a hadith scholar and a Naqshbandi Sufi. Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi was also the teacher of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, right? But Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi had connections back to Ibrahim Qurani. And so one of the things that Ibrahim Qurani is doing is really defending Ibn Arabi, defending the idea of wahdat al-wujud. And I thought that was important because there are some people mistakenly think that, the Tijaniyya is a sort of retreat from the theosophic Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and they even go so far as to say, well, the Tijaniyya doesn't, has tended away from wahdat al-wujud, the kind of idea of oneness of being. That's not the case, right? Very much part of this tradition of Ibrahim Qurani. And so then there's, of course, the traditions of Indian Sufism coming out of Muhammad al-Ghawth and the Shatariya Sufi order, particularly through the book, the Five Pearls, the Jawahir al-Khams, that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is getting initiation in and is actually writing, copying in his own hand portions of that book. And then there are other, of course, the Shazali traditions of North Africa that were there before. Shaykh Ahmad Tijani had close connections with them. And of course, the Khalwatiyya Sufi order that comes out of Turkey originally, but has seen a revival or led a revival of Sufism and Islamic orthodoxy in Syria and in Egypt during the period. So this really connects Shaykh Ahmad Tijani from India to West Africa to Syria, Turkey, to Egypt, to the formative, most vibrant intellectual revivals of their time. And I think that was important is not, the story of the Tijaniyya is not just that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani saw the Prophet out of nowhere and then got the tariqa. And so that, but by extension, not that anybody who sees the Prophet is just like Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. No, right? He was a renowned scholar connected with the most vibrant traditions of his time, and he had very close Sheikh disciple relations with many of the great scholars of the period. And so when he emerges he had already emerged as a Sheikh of the Khalwatiyya, right, in North Africa before he is instructed by the Prophet to start his own tariqa. But so that's the kind of story that I wanted to tell in the beginning of that book.
MashaAllah. Imam Talut, MashaAllah, nice to have you in again. MashaAllah, we miss you because last week we were sick. Shafakallah. And in regards to the tariqa Tijani, and a lot of people always question about the conditions that you can't visit other saints and all that. Perhaps you like to share the light of the reality of the path itself and why it is in such a manner, and why is it important, because the path itself is tarbiyah and so on. Yeah, Imam.
So, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, the conditions of the tariqa Tijaniyya are not, they seem strange in our time, and that is because a lot of tasawwuf, a lot of later tasawwuf took on a sort of tabarruk kind of feel, where it was mostly you were taking, awrad, and you were taking things for barakah of the different shuyukh, and a lot of initiation into tasawwuf in later times didn't involve tarbiyah. And so one of the things that the Tijaniyya, that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu revived, by command of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that his tariqa, no matter why you take it, his tariqa has conditions, because his tariqa, his awrad, they contain, the basis of tarbiyah in his path. And so these conditions that some people find to be too strict, they come from a point of view that you are entering this tariqa to travel the path, to receive tarbiyah, and to enter the divine presence and the presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's no other reason for you to be taking this tariqa. And so if that is the case, and you really want to enter into the divine presence, then there's no need for you to look anywhere else. And so the condition, especially what people have with the ziyarah, with not being able to visit, different awliya, living in or passed on, they have problems with this, because they don't understand that this is a way that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu is instilling the main principle of traveling in the path and his students, and that is sidq. Sidq is that you, in terms of tasawwuf, Shaykh Ibrahim radiallahu anhu, he defines sidq as having one direction in the path. You have one direction in the path. And so how do you do this? You make your sheikh one. And, just like you made your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam one. And if your sheikh is one and your Prophet is one, and then the path is straight. If you have different shuyukh and they all connect to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you have a longer and very sometimes even perilous path. And so this was one of the reasons that ziyarah is strictly forbidden, in this path. Not is not disrespect, of course, because the sheikh, he would always mention, after that he would always mention ma'ahtiram, with respect and veneration for all of the awliya. It's not, and love and veneration for all of the awliya, whether they're in this tariqa or not. So the prohibition of visitation has nothing to do with whether or not one venerates the awliya. It's more to do with the fact that you see your door to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, and no one else. And this is this is also mentioned in the works of Sidi Abdul Aziz al-Dabad radiallahu anhu, who is not Tijani, who says that you will not know Allah until you become extinguished in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you will not become extinguished in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam until you become extinguished in your sheikh, and you will not become extinguished in your sheikh until you pray the funeral prayer over all of creation. And that doesn't mean that you literally see them as dead. It means that for all of your spiritual benefit, you go to your sheikh and your sheikh alone. And you venerate, the people that deserve veneration, but for you, your sheikh is your door, and that's who you're going to for your spiritual benefit. And it doesn't really, it doesn't entail, what people accuse people of disrespecting the awliya. It doesn't entail that, and even, Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, he said that, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, there is something that there's a matter that the sheikhs have neglected, in their path, and because of their neglecting it, many of their murids have gone astray. And that is that if somebody knows one sheikh and visits another, then he will not benefit from either of them. And what he means is that if somebody gives bay'ah to a sheikh and is in his path and is on his path, and then goes and visits someone else, another sheikh who has another path, for benefit, then, it will cancel his benefit from his sheikh, and he will not benefit from the other sheikh. And so these are principles that were laid down, in tasawwuf from early on, but they were abandoned, at certain times, and part of the reason that they were abandoned was because there was corruption amongst some of the people who pretended to be sheikhs, and they would basically enslave their murids, take all of their money, take all of their, all of their possessions, and then make them in service to them. And so some reformers in their path, they abolished, certain rules regarding the sheikh, in order to combat that. But it was these things, when people come and they reform certain things, then they're restricted to that time and that circumstance. And so it wasn't supposed to be a universal rule, but it became a universal rule. Just like the declaration of Abu Abbas al-Hadrami, the Sheikh of Zarruq, who said that the training by the traditional methods of the Sufis has ceased. And he said that, and he gave certain principles for his path that Sidi Zarruq he transmits, and at the conclusion of his qawaid of tasawwuf, the principles of tasawwuf, but that wasn't supposed to be a universal rule. That was for his time and in his circumstance. And if certain circumstances or certain times are equal to what was going on in his time, then yes, then you can apply it. But it doesn't mean that all tarabiyyah is cut off. So when these principles are suspended by certain shuyukh in their path, Shaykh Al-Arabi ibn Sayyih, he in Bugyatul Mustafid in the beginning, he quotes from different shuyukh who say that the sheikhs in their path, meaning the sheikhs who are the grand sheikhs of the turuq, their position in their path is like the position of the mujtahids and the madahib, and the mujtahids in the schools of law. That is, that they extract they extract the rulings of their path that are beneficial for their murids. That doesn't mean that they cancel the rulings of the path of other people's path that is beneficial for their murids. That's not what that means. Just as Imam Abu Hanifa ruling that qabd below the navel is sunnah doesn't cancel Imam Malik's ruling that of sadr. They're two mujtahids who have extracted from the Quran and Sunnah those rulings. The same way the shuyukh, they find in the spiritual training of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of the companions, and the spiritual guidance of the Quran, they find certain principles and they apply certain principles in their path that are beneficial for their murids. And so when people come and they apply, they say, okay, so strict visitation or strict prohibition of visitation isn't necessary anymore. That's for their murids, and the people that branch off from that path, but it doesn't apply universally. And so the universal principle of not visiting other than your sheikh remains for anyone who wants to apply it. And so Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu was not applying anything new. He was actually applying the old rule, that you stick with your sheikh until you get all of what he has for you. And in terms of the Tijaniyya, Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu is the Khatam al-Awliya, and he's the Qutb al-Maktoum. He's the seal of the saints, and he's the hidden pole. And that means that, there's no end to what our Shaykh has for us. So there's no need, there's nothing over the Khatam al-Awliya except for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If that is the case, then there's no need for you to go anywhere else. You have Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have the Qutb al-Maktoum. And so if you enter into the ahad, if you enter into the covenant of the Qutb al-Maktoum, then you have no need of going to anyone else. And if you are looking anywhere else for your spiritual guidance, then this is a sign that you need to correct your intention upon entering the path. So that's and the other conditions, they have the same, sticking to the weird, that's the ahad of every sheikh. Having to do the weird, in the morning and evening, that's the ahad of every sheikh. You can't enter a path without without doing that. Having to do the awrad until death, this is the same as the condition of visitation. And these are just the conditions to enter the path. We have many more conditions that one has to try and apply in his life in order to really perfect his traveling of the Tijani path. The one of the things that I had wanted to mention or comment on from what Sayyidi Zachariah was saying, is that when we read, when we're reading the primary sources, and actually, because Jawahir al-Ma'ani is a book that gathers together a lot of different sources, I've had to actually, read different sources and things like that. And, one of the things that is apparent when you're reading the book, first of all, his student is not a scholar by any means. Sidi Ali Harazim was not a scholar. He was a person who, he had a little bit of reading, and in the books of Sharia, and he fell in love with the works of the Sufis. And when he found Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, he completely dedicated himself to him. And this is before Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu had the path from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was khalwati when he met Sidi Ali Harazim. And then when Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu received his path, he entered his path without fail. And so the Jawahir al-Ma'ani is compiled by a non-scholar, yet it references, many scholarly works, and Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, the fact that, all of the people mentioned and he's asked about them, and what they said, and he gives clear and methodical answers on what they meant and what they what the different intellectual currents said about certain verses of the Quran, what the different intellectual currents said about certain hadith, and he was keenly aware of all of that. Is a very clear sign that he was one of the eminent scholars of his time. There's if you read Jawahir al-Ma'ani and you read with a clear mind, and you see that he's referencing the Maturidis, and their positions. How do you reference the Maturidis? If you're not a scholar in that time and you live in North Africa, which is predominantly Ash'ari, they don't, and they don't, the references to the Maturidi, tradition and the West African Ash'ari tradition isn't really, they don't, it isn't a fair assessment. But Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu gives a clear assessment of what they're saying. And and so this clearly shows that he was a studied person. He was a person who had a wide range of knowledge. And this goes back to something that I said a few years ago after completing the translation, and I was moving on to a different translation. when you see, you read the works, on or works by, these different shuyukh, you get an idea of people who were, they were completely immersed in the Islamic tradition, but they were keenly aware of their time and the needs of their time. And so, that's what makes, the Tijaniyya such a wonderful path for our time, is that the Sheikh was keenly aware of his time and the needs of people who would come after him. And so his path only incorporates what they need, and his path excludes things, that would have become a hindrance for people these days. For the ziyarah, the ziyarah of different awliya, has become a fitna in our time. Where there's so much fitna going on between different Sufi orders and things like this, and to a large extent, the followers of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, who are excluded from this. We have our own problems, but we're excluded from a lot of the larger fitness that go on, because we don't meddle, and so for to some extent, Shaykh Ahmed Tijani, who has set down principles in his path that have saved his students from a lot of the fitna that is going on, and the fitna to come, in the last days.
MashaAllah, beautifully said. Thank you, Imam Talut. And we also have another blessed guest, Sidi Ibrahim Dimson, from Atlanta, but right now he's in Senegal, MashaAllah. How are you, Sidi, over there?
We're doing very well, alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum to all of the esteemed panelists, to you, Sidi
Yeah,
Khalid,
MashaAllah.
and everyone that's
Yeah. How
viewing this.
how's the atmosphere there? We recently lost the Khalifa Shaykh Ahmad Tijani and also his
Mhm,
brothers, right? Uh,
mhm.
were you there during the Salat Janazah and so on?
I was for each of those. Prior to that loss, we also lost our grandmother, Sayyidah Yafatu Yas,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
mother of Sheikh
yeah.
Hassan, the daughter of Sheikh Ibrahim and Imam Sheikh, mother of Imam Sheikh and
Mm,
Sheikh Mani Sisi. So it's been a difficult time this past 30 to 45 days.
mm, Allah. Sidi, is really interesting. Thanks to you, the Faida books that you publish, some of the work of Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, and also recently, congratulations on the release of the Jawi Ma'ani, is working with Imam Talut. Uh, and we read before about your story on the tariqa and so on. So what inspired you to start the Faida books, and what can we learn from your experience even on the tariqa as a person, or and your journey itself? Yeah.
Um, well, what inspired me initially, um, to start Fader Books, and I actually remember a conversation I had with Professor Zachary when I was making the intention almost 8 years ago. Um, what actually inspired me had very little to do with tariqa. The inspiration came from the fact that throughout my life, uh, the only literature that was very, very much available and prevalent in the Muslim communities, were literature that was being promulgated by our brothers on the Salafi Wahhabi side. And for that reason, there was a great deal of misunderstanding, uh, lack of knowledge with regards to Tasawwuf, Sufism, um, and that disturbed me quite a bit for most of my teenage years and on into university. And I tried to understand why that was. And I quickly realized you had one group subsidized by Saudi petrodollars, and they were able to publish and translate and get a great deal of their works out by some of their scholars of old, like Ibn Taymiyyah. And then explained by the more contemporary scholars, like Sheikh bin Baz and Ibn Uthaymin and so forth and so on. And I always desired to create a way with which the literature of the tariqa Tijaniyya and also the specific literature of Shaykh Ibrahim and the scholars within the community of the Faida, I've always desired to translate and bring their works to the forefront. Alhamdulillah, with the passage of time, technology has made it much easier. Social media has made it very, very easy to basically compete on a more level ground with the publishing companies that have much more larger budgets and just behemoths in the Islamic book sphere. So what we did was we spoke with Sidi Zakaria, and prior to that, I would like to say one of the inspirations I can say. Can you hear me well? Okay, so one of the inspirations I can say was actually you, Sidi Khalid, with the book you published, Islam, the Religion of Peace, a book that you published for Imam Shaykh Tijani Sisi. That was actually one of the main catalysts that made me realize that this is doable. So I wanted to thank you formally for doing that, and the work of Sutilahi is absolutely amazing. And then we had the Ruhul Adab that our beloved Sheikh Hassan Sisi translated many years ago and was published initially by the AAII. And we looked at the Kashful al-Libas, which was translated by Sidi Zakaria and a team of scholars. And I realized quickly that this is something that's actually possible. We consulted with Sidi Zakaria. We sought the permission from Imam Shaykh Tijani Sisi, and wallahi, it's been a miracle. Every publication is miraculous. Everyone who puts their hand into translating, and I've been working over the past few years very closely with Sidi Talut, and with several translations. The latest translation being the first volume of the Jawahir. Every translator from Sidi Zakaria to Sidi Talut have been absolutely amazing to work with. They understand the mission. This is not something that we're probably never going to become wealthy from, but it wasn't a matter of wealth. It was a matter of doing a service to the Muslim community in general, and specifically assisting the Tijani community, particularly with regards to literature in the English language. And Faded Books hopes to, it's very soon, and actually before the end of the year, transition into areas where the literature will become more available in the original sources of Arabic, also the translated English and then French, and inshallah with the assistance of Sidi Talut in Spanish. So these are some of our motivations. We ask for all of you to keep praying for us and supporting us, and we appreciate everyone.
Inshallah, beautifully shared, Sidi Ibrahim. May Allah preserve you in all the works that you have done. And I think there's so many people who are like me who are benefiting from the books. MashaAllah. Going back to Shaykh Zachary Wright, right? Shaykh, you know that there's always a saying about this tariqa Muhammadiyah, and the history of tariqa Muhammadiyah are mainly in the North Africa. They say that it's Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, and all that. So, is Tariqa Tijani considered as part of it, or is there such a thing as Tariqa Muhammadiyah? So how does this sort of link and connected, or it is not? Yeah.
That's a good question. One of the debates that academic researchers are having right now about the 18th century is about local context versus, um, like, I guess, schools of thought, right?
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, you have people like John Vole, who have earlier on kind of postulated about um, a kind of global fascination with hadith study in ijtihad and these kinds of things during the 18th century. And in that conversation, you can find affixed conversations about tariqa Muhammadiyya. And I think that's where you find kind of my first book, On the Path of the Prophet, kind of weighing in on that and saying, yeah, there was this worldwide conversation about tariqa Muhammadiyya, and the Tijaniyya was very much a part of that. And then on the other hand, you have people like Ahmed Dalal, who's a dean here at Georgetown in Qatar, who wrote a really great book called Islam Without Europe. And he really concentrates on people like Muhammad Shawkani and Muhammad al-Sunusi in Yemen and North Africa, respectively. And he's arguing more for, that these were really incredible intellectuals. They saw themselves as the intellectual peers of people like Al-Ghazali and others, the greatest scholars of the Islamic past. So that therefore the 18th century was not a period of intellectual stagnation and decline, but rather one of vibrancy. But that what they were primarily interested in was getting the Islamic traditions to speak to their local constituencies. And I heard Imam Talut saying a similar thing. And so my more recent research has kind of tried to situate it in between these two polarities. And I think the end of the day, yes, there is a discussion about tariqa Muhammadiyya from the late 17th century into the 18th century. But it means different things for different people. And the idea that there's somehow this sort of corporate organization called the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, of which the Tijaniyya is one offshoot, is patently false, right? So yes, there, people like Murtada Zabidi are talking about Tariqa Muhammadiyya, and people like Nasir Andalib, the father of Mir Dard in India, are talking about Tariqa Muhammadiyya. Even the earlier Jazuliyya in Morocco and is also talking about Tariqa Muhammadiyya. But that doesn't mean that they were all, thought about the idea in the same way. And so the Tijaniyya, the primary sources of the Tijaniyya do talk about what the Tijani perspective of Tariqa Muhammadiyya is. And I think in ideological terms, it essentially means that the real sheikh of the Tijaniyya is the Prophet Muhammad, and that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is the Muqaddam, right? Is the propagator, lieutenant who kind of popularizes this Sufi order of the Prophet Muhammad. And practically, it means that the fundamental practice of the Tijaniyya is Salat ala Nabi, prayer upon the Prophet. And so in that way, I mean, there are some similarities, right? Some of the followers of Ahmad ibn Idris said similar things, but the idea that this is actually the same tariqa, I think, is erroneous.
Inshallah. Thank you, Sheikh.
So this debate about whether there is a tariqa Muhammadiyya and what it is, and this has actually been going on since people started speaking of tariqa Muhammadiyya. And Sidi Al-Arabi bin Saih, he actually addresses it in Bughyatul Mustafid, in the section on the different names of the Tariqa Tijaniyya, and the section on it being called Muhammadiyya. He addresses that, and he addresses people that say, well, there's no Tariqa Muhammadiyya. And, he basically says what Sidi Zakaria said, that it's not an organized, this is a tariqa and organized, and it has different offshoots, but it has key principles. And so among the principles that he mentioned, are, that are the two things that Sidi Zakaria mentioned as the Tijani definition is, the focus on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as the source and as the Shaykh, and the focus on Salat al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he actually quotes a few different shuyukh who have espoused this idea of tariqa Muhammadiyya, and that their path is to follow the Quran and the Sunnah, to and to make copious amounts of salawat on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam until we meet him in our dreams and in our wakeful state. And so this is they're as far as being an organized order in terms of how we view turuq, then this is like he said, it's false. And this is the same conclusion that you get from Bughat al-Mustafid. But there are key principles that unite all of these different orders, and that these orders that are called Muhammadan or Muhammadiyya, they all stick to, and I think you can find those principles in all of them. Alhamdulillah. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think it's a good discussion. I think what you're describing is sort of like a methodology, right? That's pretty common. But still, I think like we have to kind of go down to the lowest common denominator, because if we start talking, I mean, granted, as you spoke about very coherently, the Tijaniyya has a pretty traditional understanding of Sheikh-disciple relations, right? And so other Tariqa Muhammadiyya movements, like the followers of Sidi Ahmed ibn Idris, have a very different understanding of Sheikh disciple. They don't call, Ahmed ibn Idris only like to be called Ustaz. And for that matter, the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, I find this is an interesting coincidence, that Hassan ibn Abi Talib appears to Nasr Andalib right around the same year that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani was born, and says, I'm giving you the Tariqa Muhammadiyya. And that's the first kind of like direct transmission, that even though Tariqa Muhammadiyya was used as in terminology ways earlier, this is the first instance that I know publicly where through kind of initiatory ru'ya that somebody gets the tariqa, something called the Tariqa Muhammadiyya in this way. And even as this methodology later on develops out of India, Mirdard is very much interested in poetry as a methodology of connecting. So I think that the general point is this difficult to sustain the idea that, as you were saying, that this is one kind of corporate organization that everybody thinks the same, but there are kind of foundational principles or methodologies, I think is a good word, that describe what this is. Yeah, and Umar Futital is actually predated, I think, Ibn Sa'i in talking about what Tariqa Muhammadiyya actually means. Yeah.
Sheikh Zachary, just holding on to you to continue. How is it that this tariqa, when Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, may Allah be pleased with him, when he passed on, that he was buried in Morocco, Fez, but the tariqa is like what you mentioned, has a strong spread, connection, and link to the entire Africa, especially the West Africa, right? So how can we learn that history, that how it goes about, and it's like an ocean, it's like a waves, and we know Sheikh Ibrahim has sort of revive it and bring it more towards to the African and also to the humanity. Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think, well, one of the misnomers is that the Tijaniyya is only in parentheses, Black African Sufi order, right? The fact is that up until the 1930s, the Tijaniyya was the most popular Sufi order in Morocco, and this is attested by French ethnographers. And this is counting the Shazaliya not as one order, but different, or like the Darkawiya as a different order. But it basically meant that in every city in Morocco, up until 1930s or 40s, there was a Zawiya. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that actually there's also been a mistaken understanding that it's only because of Moulay Suleiman, the Sultan of Morocco, his support for the Tijaniyya, that it gets established in Morocco. And if it wasn't for Moulay Suleiman, then the Tijaniyya would have sort of faded out. The reality is that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani already had a very large following in Algeria. And it wasn't just, people from the oases. They were major scholars from urban areas, and very wealthy people, like Sidi Adi Tamasini in the east of Algeria. But one of the primary motors then, of course, is these Shinkiti scholars. And the thing to know about the Shinkiti scholars is that they were, so Abdurrahman al-Shinkiti was a scholar who died right, I think in like 1807. So kind of before Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, but he was living and teaching in Fez, and he was known to be the greatest scholar in Fez. And so any of you know, if you've been to Fez, Bab Boujalud, that mosque right outside Bab Boujalud, Abdurrahman al-Shinkiti used to teach in that mosque. And he had all of the ulama of Fez gathered with him, studying with him. And at one time, Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, when he first arrives in Fez, he goes to pray in the mosque. He makes 2 rakahs to greet the mosque. And then as soon as Shaykh Ahmad Tijani finishes, Abdurrahman al-Shinkiti leaves his majlis of his students and goes to sit with Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. And then later the students are kind of upset. They say, we're only with you because we think there's nobody that has the same type of knowledge that you do here, And Abdurrahman al-Shinkiti says, by Allah, there's nobody on the face of the earth with more knowledge than that man that's just come in from the desert.
No.
So this goes to show then that these Shinkiti scholars were very important for attesting to the scholarship of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. And of course, not only through the Western Shinkiti, but also through the desert oases like Tuat that was on the Trans-Saharan caravan route. So that was a bit further to the east. These would have been avenues for expansion or proselytization of the Tijaniyya south of the Sahara. But really, I think one of the other impediments to our understanding is to recognize that the Sahara Desert is not an impenetrable desert, right? That this was actually a zone of exchange. And so that West African scholars of Timbuktu, etc., shared much with their Moroccan and Algerian counterparts, and were exchanging books and scholars, but never actually saw themselves as inferior. Well, there wasn't a racial thing, right? I mean, some of the scholars of Timbuktu really criticized the scholars of Morocco for being dogmatically attached to the Maliki madhab, for example, even though the scholars of Timbuktu were also Maliki, but they thought that the Moroccans were too dogmatically attached. So this was a shared zone of exchange. So although Shaykh Ahmad Tijani didn't have any direct contact, right? I mean, he did go to Tuat quite often. But he didn't have any direct contact with a Black African scholar that I could find in the primary sources. And that's dissimilar to somebody like Sidi Abdulaziz Dabagh that Imam Talut mentioned, right? That Dabagh really gets his, I think his primary initiation, one could argue, from the Sheikh Barnawi, who appears in Fez and initiates him and basically says, now that I've put you in the presence of the Prophet, I no longer have fear for you, so I'm going back to my own country. And so you could, this is also evidence then that there's been this exchange, right, between sub-Saharan Africa and Morocco for generations prior to Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, and that this was sort of this would have been a natural conclusion, right? If something, a major intellectual event happens in Morocco, scholars in West Africa would know about it right away, right? And they'd be interested in it. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned previously, that they're interested in it is because Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is saying many of the same things that they've already said, right? He's talking about respect for the Maliki school. He says, this is our school. But he is emphasizing the capacity for continued ijtihad within the school. That's something that the scholars of Timbuktu, the scholars of West Africa also said, and in contradistinction to the scholars of Morocco. He's talking about this Muhammadan Sufism, which they're also very interested in, right? And arguably the Qadiriyya and the Tijaniyya, for all practical purposes, really appear in West Africa right around the same time with Mukhtar Kunti. And this idea that the Qadiriyya is brought to West Africa with Abdul Karim Magili in the I think the 15th or 16th centuries is, I think most historians have proved, is basically historical imagination. But because Magili is ignored by the scholars of Timbuktu during his own time, actually. He's thought to be a joke or a sycophant. But so there's this, basically the 18th century is a time that it's not that Sufism didn't exist in West Africa prior to the 18th century. It's arguably that these scholars of Timbuktu and elsewhere felt themselves they didn't feel themselves beholden to Sufi orders emerging from elsewhere, right? They had their own traditions of walaya, and that's very clear if you read the Timbuktu Chronicles. There's references to walaya, there's references to ma'arifa, there's references even to Qutbaniya in the 16th century in Morocco, in Timbuktu, right? So they have these prior understandings of Sufism, but not really associated with any particular Sufi orders. Arguably, that's because they don't feel the need to. But with the Qadiriyya as taught by Mukhtar Kunti, and with the Tijaniyya, I think at this time is when they start seeing the advantages now of a more a more close affiliation with a global Sufi network or the Sufi order. And a lot of that had to do with, historical reasons in the 18th century in West Africa that are actually reference social history, right? There's ways in which the clerical lineages, the scholarly lineages, were finding themselves, in need of breaking through or casting off old alliances with the Anshian regime, with the kings of the past, who were sometimes nominally Muslim, but because of the transatlantic slave trade had increasingly started to raid their own populations, including Muslim populations, right? So this is the background for the jihads that sweep through West Africa. And Sufi orders, namely the Qadiriyya and the Tijaniyya, are very instrumental in being able to make these authoritative claims against the kings that were there before, and also to unite followers across ethnic lines, which previously scholars had found themselves kind of constrained within these clerical communities. So the kings had said, okay, fine, we're gonna give you land, you can teach Islam, but you gotta stay where you are, right? And don't mess with our authority. With the jihads, that starts to change. And there's no accident then that the Sufi order has become coupled to the expressions of jihad from the 18th century in West Africa. And so this is really the engine by which the Sufi orders get known, is an actual internal revolution in West Africa that casts off, and one could argue is a result of the transatlantic slave trade, that casts off what's seen as an oppressive monarchy and sets up a new political order. And the Sufi orders are actually ways in which you can integrate large numbers of peoples into these new communities, right? So colonial occupation really stops that in its tracks, but arguably the Muslims win the day, and that the story of them winning that day is people like Shaykh Ahmad Bamba, Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, Al-Hajj Malik Si, that really constitute these new communities right under the noses of colonial occupation, and make Islam and their Sufi orders the primary, expressions of self-worth and of community solidarities, and in this even an anti-colonial moment, right? Even a post-colonial movement also. So I know I've covered a lot of ground there, but there's a lot of pieces to that story why the Sufi orders and the Tijaniyya in particular become very popular in 18th century, even though, or in the 19th century in West Africa, even though there weren't really large-scale affiliations to Sufi orders prior to that time.
MashaAllah, Shaykh, very beautiful. Getting to the continuation of that Sufism in Africa, right? Sidi Ibrahim, there are a lot of people around the world that doesn't know much about the African Sufism. And Shaykh Zachary Wright had mentioned about Shaykh Ahmad Banba and Shaykh Ibrahim, and also we know Shaykh Osman Fodio. Uh, what would you like to describe to the world about this African Sufism heritage that we do not know much from it, but it has a very profound heritage in terms of knowledge, ma'rifah, traditional Islam. Yeah.
I think traditionally, the Islamic world, I think the layman, as well as the scholarly world, has assumed that the intellectual Islam, tasawwuf, spirituality is confined only to the Arab Muslim world, which was a big mistake. One of the driving forces behind our publishing of the books of the Tariqa Tijaniyya, specifically from the community of the Faida, has to do with dispelling that myth, the myth that Islam, in all of its facets, Islam with regards to the Sharia, Islam with regards to the aspect of faith, and Islam with regards to the aspect of spirituality or ihsan, maqam ihsan, that African Islamic tradition has no real say there. Well, in fact, we have proven with just the publishing of a few titles, and inshallah bringing out more titles like the Rimah, these types of books, that the intellectual presence and the richness of literature and the richness of intellectual Islam, whether it's having to do with the sciences of the Sharia, the sciences of Tasawwuf, are actually one of the more poignant, one of the more diverse, one of the more important, and one of the more absolutely amazing aspects of Islamic intellectual studies. And people just don't know. People assume that Islam in quote unquote Black Africa has no real contribution or doesn't have an intellectual history. And you know, one of the books that people constantly uh, return to me discussing about how amazing it is the Kashf al-Albas, which Fader Books did not originally publish, but which is a book that we took over the revised edition and published. And inshallah, City Zachariah will continue to revise and republish. It's one of the most amazing books that proves the intellectual richness of Islam and all of its dimensions. Um, so part of our mission is to bring uh, that myth um, to a halt. The myth that uh, African Islam hasn't contributed and does not continue to contribute, when in fact the facts may uh, tell a completely different story. In that, for all intents and purposes, its contribution has been greater than any other intellectual source from the other regions of the Islamic world.
Thank you, Sidi. MashaAllah, beautifully said and explained. Right, Sidi Talut. They always said that this tariqa Tijani, tarbiyah, and so on. How would you describe about this tarbiyah? Because they're saying that, oh, you in these difficult times, right now, especially now with lots of calamities, and also people had no time at all. Time moved very fast, especially in the city. And they said that, oh, we can do khalwat, we can do seclusion. But at the same time, this tariqah Tijani has something unique, like from Shaykh Ibrahim, the tarbiyah and so on. So how would you describe actually what is really tarbiyah, what is really spiritual training? Because like you mentioned before, that people now just going for spiritual blessing, barakah. Right. So what is it that in this Tijani path that tarbiyah is something to be taken seriously, and you are not in a state of seclusion also, right? So yeah, Imam.
So I think there's a few different questions. Uh, Primarily, what is the difference between tabarruk and tarbiyah? What is the difference between just seeking blessing and tarbiyah? So the Tijaniyya, for example, there's benefits to just loving Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu, and then there's benefits to taking his wird, and practicing his wird, and these are benefits that are promises, you know, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for example, if someone loves Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu and continues to love him until he dies, then he will be he will die a believer, and that person is also promised wilaya. And if someone takes the weird, then he's promised the Fatul Akbar before he passes away. you know. But the being promised the Fatul Akbar before you pass away, this could come like a few moments before you pass away, and then you get the Fatul Akbar and then you're gone. This is not. This is the extent of seeking barakah in the tariqa Tijaniyya. Um, Seeking barakah in general, what it means a lot for different turuq. So I can't say that this is a universal meaning, but in general, what people mean is that they are connecting themselves to different awliya, in order to be connected with them and to be included in the statement, you are with those who you love. And so that would be the extent of, or the general intention behind seeking barakah. When one is seeking tarbiyah, then he is seeking to know Allah. And when we say we're seeking to know Allah, the tarbiyah in reality has no end. So we have to put that into perspective, because a lot of people, they think the tarbiyah is just what these dhikrs that you get from your muqaddam, and you end it and you're finished. You know, so knowing Allah is, we seek to know Allah so that we may worship Allah as He should be worshipped. And so knowing Allah and worshiping Allah as He should be worshipped is the purpose of tarbiyah. And so for this, it requires there are requirements over that of just seeking a path for barakah. And so, because there are people who have sought the Tijani path for barakah, and it's not for that, so to speak, because in reality, the Tijani path is tarbiyah. The basis of all of the shuyukh across all of their different traditions from the Tijaniyya say that the basis of the tarbiyah is the 5 salats and at their proper time, and doing the awrad al-lazima, and then filling your time with salat al-fatih. This is the basic tarbiyah of our path. And this can be done without seclusion. Seclusion was done in different ways throughout history. People think seclusion has to be going into the desert and staying there for 40 years until you get the Fatul Akbar. And some people did it that way. In fact, Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, he did khalwa in Ain Madi, where he received the Fatul Akbar. And so this is a practice of khalwa. But there's also a practice of khalwa for your riyadat, which are your spiritual practices. And so that is that you in your home, or in your home, or if you have access to it in another building, you set aside a room where that is your room where you will do all of your spiritual practices. And you go there and you do your outrod for an hour, and then that's your khalwa. And then in the evening you go there and you do your awrad, and that's your khalwa. And then and this is actually set down as a principle, and or in one of the letters of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, that you set aside a time, in every 2 times in every day, or what is superior is to set aside 3 times in every day, once in the morning, once in the evening, and once in the middle of the night, where you turn to Allah completely, and what he means is that you isolate yourself for ibadah. And so, and this doesn't have to be a long time. If you are only able to do 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening, then this is complete. This is actually this is actually included in this type of khalwa, where you isolate yourself for certain parts of the day. You isolate yourself for worship. And so this is tarbiyah. And if you want to know Allah, or you want to travel the path of knowing Allah, then there's tarbiyah, that is tarbiyah to khasa, special tarbiyah. So we have muqaddams of general tarbiyah, who are able to give the awrad, and the awrad, like Shaykh Ibrahim, in a live session a few weeks ago said, the awrad of this Tijaniyya are tarbiyah. They are spiritual training. However, people only give what they have, and so there are people who have the general tarbiyah of this tariqa, and then there are people who have special tarbiyah. And Shaykh Ibrahim Niyaz was not just one of the people who have special tarbiyah, but probably the muqaddam of special tarbiyah who has had the most success in the history of Tijaniyya. And so his special tarbiyah is to immerse the the murid, and dhikrs that will immerse him into the divine presence, and then to while when he is in that presence, to direct his contemplation towards what will give him understanding of those experiences. And so it involves special dhikrs and stuff like that, but you do what you can. It's not something where this is law. You have to do this every day. You do what you can, and like they say, Allah is the real murabbi, and so you won't get anything before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it.
MashaAllah, Imam beautifully explained about this tarbiyah, because I think sometimes people get confused what is tarbiyah, and you define it and you explain it in detail. MashaAllah, I'm going to stick with you. What was your view, or what was your expectation, or what's your opinion in regards that when Jawahir Ma'ani is being published, it's been out, thanks to Sidi Ibrahim, may Allah preserve him for this beautiful work, on that the world finally see the other sort of Sufism. I would not say a different sort of Sufism, because even you mentioned, even our Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, and even Shaykh Ibrahim has also like to quote some of the Sufi from the past, but it is something sort of a different school of thoughts, not like what people has been used to, right? So, what do people expect from it, and what sort of difference in that particular books and way of tariqah? Yeah.
So I think the intention that the author, or the compiler mentioned in the introduction to Jawahir al-Ma'ani is key. to what you can expect in Jawahir al-Ma'ani. And so the primary intention of Sidi Ali Harazim, it was to inspire the Murids, to be spurred on to travel the path of Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu, to inspire them and give them energy, to seek out, what they are missing, in the path, and to seek out, these spiritual experiences, the spiritual knowledge that is available through the wellspring of Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu. And so, and the first volume deals mostly with the biography, which I think that Sidi Zacharia's book is a great complement for that. It deals mostly with the biography of Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu, but it does give an explanation of his philosophy on the Shaykh and the Murid, and also his philosophy on different things, on the Ismu Adam and the rewards of different awrad. So the first volume, what you should come away with is a renewed and invigorated love of the Shaykh radiallahu anhu, because you see his complete adherence to the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the point that Sidi Ali Harazim, Sidi Ali Harazim, you have to put his book into perspective of he was a murid who had perfect adab with the maqam of his Shaykh, perfect adab with when mentioning his Shaykh. And so that Sidi Zachary, he mentions that the maqam of Qutb al-Maktoum, and even Khatmiyya is only alluded to in the Jawahir al-Ma'ani. It's never actually mentioned. And to me, that speaks more to the adab of Sidi Ali Harazim, of not mentioning specifically what the Shaykh has not given him permission to mention specifically. And so he was like the idea of the perfect murid, and in our time, an example of that would be Sayyid Ali Sisi, who who only mentioned he was a complete khadim of Shaykh Ibrahim Niyaz radiallahu anhu. He didn't go beyond what his Shaykh told him to do, and he didn't fail in what his Shaykh wanted from him. And so, and he showed perfect adab with the Shaykh. But if we want to see an example of what I'm talking about, then Sayyid Ali Sisi and how he interacted with Shaykh Ibrahim Niyaz radiallahu anhu, which you can still get, you can still learn from people who are living today, then that's an example of this perfect adab that I'm speaking about. And so, back to the point about, Sidna Shaykh following the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the point that he would correct scholars who he saw doing something that, may have been, may not have been haram, but may have been what they call in fiqh terms, not the best thing to do. And so, and how he would correct them and say, هكذا ورد في السنة, has that been narrated in the Sunnah? And he would correct even the scholars. Sidi Ali Harazim doesn't say scholars. He says, if it's someone who has some knowledge of the Sunnah or someone who should know better, then he says that, but he's talking about, scholars, because that's who Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu was actually dealing with, so that the reality is that, if you go to Jawahir al-Ma'ani as a Tijani, then I hope that from the first volume you will come away with a renewed and invigorated love of the Shaykh, and a renewed and invigorated love, understanding of his philosophy on tariqa, and his philosophy on the Shaykh and Murid, and understanding of where his awrad the obligatory awrad of the Tijaniyya fit in with all of these different dhikrs that we see that come from different shuyukh and different turuq and where they are situated. That will get the first volume, inshallah, will give you this understanding. Um, when you come to the Jawahir Ma'ani in general, was because it's the first volume is only the first half really. Um, when it comes to the sections on his transmitted knowledge, then it may surprise you actually, because he speaks on a variety of different matters. And he refers to different shuyukh of the past, but he places their thinking and their thoughts, and he also places their philosophies into a very systematic understanding, and a very systematic hierarchy of where the knowledge came from, and what the purpose of the knowledge is. And so, he's very specific on the limits of scholastic theology, for example. He's very specific on the limits of that, and where certain opinions in scholastic theology have gone away from that limit. And so he brings it back to where the limit should be. In terms of tafsir of Quran, he transmits some opinions which scholars before him had considered not shad, but not the mainstream opinion. One of those is regarding the esma of the prophets alayhimus salam, and how that plays into certain things within the Quran. For example, the Quran, he said, the Quran says about Yusuf alayhi salam, that that the wife of the wazir inclined towards him and he inclined towards her. And so Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu, he puts that into perspective, of where the humanity of the prophets has a sort of interplay with their isma, where they are not, their humanity, or their human nature does not contradict the human nature of all human beings, so to speak. And so he puts that into a nice perspective of how we can understand, the human nature of the prophets, alayhimus salam, and also understand their isma. And I think that's really, really important. And this will, inshallah, be in the second volume, this discussion. But I think it's very important in a time where people go from between extremes, especially in the West. We're exposed mostly to the Deobandi and Brelwi divide, in terms of traditional Islam. That's what we're mostly exposed to. And so you have the people who argue almost superhuman prophet, that the Prophet ﷺ was superhuman. And so, they say that certain things can't affect the Prophet ﷺ because that would, affect, his perfection. And what they're really referring to is the reality of the Prophet ﷺ, which is a separate matter. And so reading the text that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani radiallahu anhu, his explanations will bring that into perspective of how the Prophet ﷺ has this untouched and immaculate reality that has no comparison and is not changed and is not affected by any of the accidental causes in creation. And then you have the Prophet ﷺ, who is a human being and is affected, by the reality or the world in which he lives. And so that feeds into people who when the Prophet ﷺ says, that women were made appealing to him out of out of this creation, they say, oh, he's referring to something else or some hidden reality in women. No, the Prophet ﷺ, he was a human being. And so, and out of all of the things that human beings desire, there were certain things that Allah, allowed his or actually instilled in him because of his reality were made to overcome his humanity, then we wouldn't be able to relate to him. And so these understandings come from reading what Sidna Shaykh radiallahu anhu is saying and what he's transmitting, and a lot of time he's transmitting from other mufassirin who make their opinions have been kind of been discarded or put to the side by the mainstream mufassirin, but it puts into perspective that the fact that he was wide read, because unless you had a wide reading of tafsir, you don't know most of these opinions, because in the tafsirs, like that are mainly studied in West Africa, North Africa, they only deal with the mainstream opinions. They don't deal with outside opinions that may have been discarded by the mainstream opinions. And so when you read Jawad al-Ma'ani, you will fall in love with this man who was in his time, he was completely and utterly immersed in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And also this he was a erudite scholar who was very keenly aware of literature in his time and the literature that came before him.
Allah, thank you very much, Imam. Getting to Shaykh Zachary Wright in regards to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which, mashallah, Imam Talut mentioned, right? There's also a myth in the tariqa Tijani that, or a wild thing to say, that someone accused of saying that Salat Fatih is better than anything else, or even better than reading on the Quran, for example. So, how authentic is this to debunk all this myth and also accusation and all that stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Imam Dawood could also speak to this, but Shaykh Ahmad Tijani effectively addresses this in Jawahir itself, and he says basically that there are different classes of people who read the Quran. And he says for the Arif Billah, the Gnostic, or the consummate Gnostic, then of course nothing is better than the Quran. And I should also back up by saying that it's like comparing apples and oranges, right? It's like saying what's better, giving sadaqah or giving zakat. Well, you can't compare the two, right? Because zakat is obligatory and sadaqah is not, right? Right? The reading of the Quran is obligatory. Shaykh Ahmad Tijani affirms that, right? It's incumbent upon you according to the Sharia, right? And we know that the Tijani disciples generally have been encouraged to read one juz of the Quran every day. And the great Qabr of this tariqa, the great sheikhs of this tariqa have done more than that. So the Quran is extremely important, and you can't leave it as a matter of the Sharia. Salat al-Fatih is something that, despite its immense benefit, is something that you can take or leave. You don't have to recite Salat al-Fatih. And so, but Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, he does say from the perspective of somebody, and this was emphasized when Sheikh Hassan Sisi, when he explained this to me many years ago, he said, there are some cases in which the Quran, if you're not acting according to what the Quran is telling you to do, because the Quran is either a witness for you or against you, that the Quran itself can be cursing you, right? If you are a person lying and the Quran says don't lie, and you're reading the Quran, then the Quran is actually cursing you for the thing that you're doing. But he said, Shaykh Hassan said, there's no narration in which any form of Salat al-Nabi, prayer upon the Prophet, is ever cursing its reciter. So in those cases, then yes, prayer, any form of prayer upon the Prophet is better for them if they're not acting according to what the Quran is saying to do. Then in terms of reward, then the prayer upon the Prophet is more appropriate for them. So just to say that it's a question of apples and oranges, and I think that's the best way to answer it. I just wanted to speak to what Imam Talut was saying, some of the very important points he was making. And I think, I think those of us have worked in the field with the text of the Tijaniyya have kind of come to grips with this paradox in a way. And one of the, basically the kind of rush and the beauty of these texts, right? And you want to get them out and you want to share them. And as Imam Talut says, when you read this Jawahir Rahmani, or you really come to grips with the actual teachings of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, that if your heart is sincere, then you can't help but fall in love with this Shaykh. And I would also, kind of push it a bit further. Imam Talut had referenced this in passing, but I would say the deep metaphysical remunerations of the Jawahir Rahmani, right? I mean, when Shaykh Ahmad Tijani talks about the Araf Billah being harf min haruf Allah, I mean, that's right, that the Gnostic is a letter from among the letters of God. I mean, this is fascinating stuff, right? When he talks about the 4 different types of thoughts, right? You have thoughts from Allah, thoughts from the angels, thoughts from your nafs, and thoughts from shaitan. Like those are deep metaphysical, I would even call it philosophy, right? That people from many, from a wider readership, whether they're Muslim or not, to be honest, would be interested in, right? I mean, effectively, he's saying that a Gnostic can see the whole universe in code, like in the movie The Matrix, right? It's interesting stuff. But on the other hand, is that these conversations, and I really understand, and I agree with why Imam Talut is really emphasizing tarbiyah and the ongoing need for a sheikh, right? Because, and I think what we're sort of witnessing right now in the English language is what was witnessed in the tariqa among Arabic speakers right around the turn of the 20th century, when a lot of the Tijani literature moved from manuscript form and got printed. And this, I think one of the first printings of the Jawahir Rahmani is in 1900, for example. And, people were conflicted, right? Some of the Tijani scholars said, no, absolutely, Jawahir Rahmani should not be published, right? And, eventually it did get published anyway. And essentially their concern was that people would be reading texts or taking texts as sheikhs instead of living exemplars of that tradition, right? And I think, by and large, the Islamic scholarly tradition has been unanimous in this, right? Ibn Jama'ah, for whatever science, right? For whatever discipline. Ibn Jama'ah he says, the great 13th century Syrian scholar, he says, the greatest calamity is to take a text instead of a sheikh, right? And there are things in the Jawahir Rahmani, if you can take it out of context, like he's making these allusions to the different prayers, like Darat al-Ahata, right? And he's talking about, this is actually where the conversation about the different names of the secret names of everything in creation. Like if you know that name, the secret name of something, its code. In other words, you can influence or exert ta'athir on that thing. Right, and so, but this comes in a conversation of this secret prayer, which he doesn't actually talk about, right? Now that and elsewhere he talks about a secret name that's specific to Ali ibn Abi Talib. But if you read that out of context, you think that that the Tijaniyya has overlooked the value of the other Sahaba, right? But if you understand it in context, right, of that particular prayer, right, which has allusion to the secret names of all of the 4 Khulafa Rashidun, right, and the 4 archangels. And so these are like layers and layers of discussion. That's what I'm just pointing to. I'm trying to reveal secrets, of course, but that there are layers and layers of understandings that can only really be situated for you. The Shaykh in the text is speaking to these multiple layers simultaneously, and you need a living exemplar to sort of not be, it's good to read, right? But in terms of actually inputting a lot of this into practice, these texts were meant to be read in the presence of sheikhs. Yeah, so that's I'd like to say. I just want, I know we're extending long, but I just wanted to say very quickly, one of the kind of place where we are right now in terms of this vast new and Fada Books has really been instrumental in this. Sautalahi has also been instrumental. If you look on, so we've constituted what's we calling a Tijani Research Council. It numbers no fewer, I think, than 30 people around the world that are doing active research on the Tijaniyya. That's really fascinating, right? And it kind of points to the idea that research now is a much more collaborative mindset, right? So if we're not careful, we're going to end up, there's going to be two people trying to translate Bughya and Mustafid at the same time, when really we could be collaborating on this. And that's one of the things I was most proud about with Kashf al-Libas, is that we were able to get a team of people together, and not only the ones that were listed on the translation, but many others also to participate in that. And I know Imam Talut has also, I know, although his name is singularly on the Jawahir, I know he also involved a larger discussion. And I think that's to all of our benefits. So, we have this really interesting thing going on right now. We have a flood of literature on the Tijaniyya being produced, and it's being consumed all over the world. Let's face it, the Tijaniyya now is not just an African tariqa, right? It's in Turkey, it's in Albania, it's in Pakistan, it's in India, it's in Indonesia. It's everywhere. And that's also, face it, that the majority language that most Muslims in the world speak today is not Arabic, right? Right? It's important to learn Arabic, but the majority language that most people are consuming their knowledge about Islam, most Muslims, is English. So we're in this really fascinating time in which there's a flood of literature being produced. And yet we still want, many of us that are producing this literature still want to point or emphasize the kind of traditional aspect that true knowledge, right, is to be attained in the presence of a person of the person. You get knowledge from person to person transmission, not from a text itself. And so, one of the ways I think that we can sort of guide that conversation going forward is to think about this more kind of collaborative work, to be in closer, we as researchers and as publishers, to be in closer conversation with the audience that's reading these books, right? What are the books that they really want to know about? And so that's, we've just launched a new website called the Tijani Literature Online Project, tijani.org. If I can share my screen, I'll show it very quickly. And so you can get a sense of, what there is here. You can see the Research Council. Many of you are listed there. And this is basically a means by which we hope to sort of coordinate these academics and lay audience. I think this panel is a really good example of what, the kind of where we should be, what we should be doing, right? We have, in other words, academic researchers, practitioners, publishers, all in a conversation together, right? So that none of us is sort of out in the left field producing something that I'm namely speaking to academics here, they're not producing something in which the practitioners themselves don't find their own voice, right? And then, I think, so we have multimedia. The Tijani Library is a really good resource here, where we can, you can have direct access to Arabic primary source material. We hope that more translations will be available here, probably in collaboration with Fada Books. We have articles which are not normally, available for academic articles are kind of hard to find unless you have a university login, but here are a lot of them that are associated with Tijaniyya, some of the manuscripts, also some of the foundational reference works here. So we hope that this can, be so it's not just this notion of a academic or a researcher in a dusty library producing literature all by himself or herself to be consumed by a nameless audience. This is an idea of a collaborative workspace, much closer interaction with readership and the producers, to kind of produce a more authentic conversation. And this is a conversation, of course, that we don't have to worry about if it's between scholars and their students in real time, in physical space, in physical proximity, right? But because now we are admitting that we're in digital space, like we're all over the world right now. We're having a conversation, right?
Yeah.
And many people who take a tariqa or even a Muslim do not have a chance to study for years, let alone months or even weeks with a licensed scholar, right? They're getting their knowledge in different ways. So we have to kind of think about how we can produce communities in new digital spaces that are still authentic, even if we are still pointing back to the importance of actual physical companionship.
MashaAllah. MashaAllah. So beautiful. Anyway, we're already near to 2 hours. MashaAllah. There's so much to talk about. But then I think time doesn't permit us. And I think we learned so much today from our three blessed guests. So before we end, I just like to ask maybe Sidi Ibrahim, if you have any last word that you like to share with the audience, with the viewers watching live right now.
Uh, what I would like to share is exactly, I would like to echo actually what my brother Sidi Ustaz Zachariah just mentioned, the Tijani.org project. It's very, very important. Despite the Tijaniya tariqa arguably being the largest, perhaps in the world, with regards to its membership, we have quite a bit more to do when it comes to propagating the tariqa through the literature specifically. And I like the emphasis he made, because this is a question that I get often. I get dozens and dozens of emails a day with regards to the literature that we publish and we produce being in and of itself enough for a seeker, as opposed to having to sit, quote unquote, at the feet of the scholars. I like Sidi Zachariah's answer to that, in that by no means is that the intention. It's just an assistance, but the true goal is to get the understanding from the sheikh and the muqaddam. But what I will say is we must emphasize that the Tijani.org project is finally a source with which people can get a much more concise understanding and better look at the different sources, the literature, the academic works that have been produced. Because oftentimes these works are available, but they're difficult to access, or they're in a type of obscure type of situation academically. Now it's open to the general public, and I would emphasize and encourage everyone to support it. Visit the site, send us your comments, your questions, and hopefully with the assistance of our beloved brother Khalid and Sutlahi, we'll be able to do more of these types of engagements and talks in the digital sphere, so that people from all over the world can benefit from scholars like Professor Zachariah and Imam Talut, inshallah. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm in no way in the league of our esteemed scholars. I'm just their servant, and it's a service that I'm very proud of. These two brothers
MashaAllah.
I've known for some time, and they're wonderful. And the service you're doing, Sidi Khalid, Rasulullahi, is absolutely unique, and I encourage everyone to support as well. Barakallah.
Thank you, Sidi Ibrahim, mashallah. We're looking forward to work on the Tijani.org, and may Allah make it successful and accept it. Now we go
Um,
to Imam Talut. If you have anything to say to share with us before we end this? Yeah.
Bismillah. I, I, I think Sidi Zakaria, he covered most of everything. The most important things. The I just like to add that Alhamdulillah, Allah has given us a manner and a way of doing khidmah to this tariqa and its people. Um, but uh, if if you enjoy the works, and you enjoy the work that people like Sidi Khalid are doing. If you're interested in the work that the initiative that Sidi Zachary has started, if you're interested in seeing more, translations, then support, and whatever way you can support. If there's a book out, help get the word out that is out, to other than just our community, because the work, it's not, it's not, uh, we don't lose anything doing the work, but it does take time and money to produce. The amount of money that went into producing Jawad and Ma'ani is a lot. The amount of money that has gone into producing several works that are going to be coming out is a lot. And alhamdulillah, there are people who actually they spend money on these things, and they helped out, but um, it, it it also needs support, through buying the books. I know City Zachary, he put his book out, in PDF form, and for free. But if you can, the print edition also. I know I don't have to say that to the bookworms out there, but there are people, if you want to support, then buy the books, inshallah. Buy the books.
Inshallah. May Allah preserve you, Imam Talut. Imam Talut have online dars with us in Singapore at like Facebook live like this on every Saturday 12 p.m. Singapore time 12 p.m. So you have to minus your local time, and it's by Sheikh Al Arabi Ibn Sa'eh book. And we've been going for I think 3 months, right, Imam? Mashallah.
Just before Ramadan, I believe,
Yeah.
right?
So yeah. So inshallah, alhamdulillah, may Allah preserve him. So Sheikh Zachary, right? Any last word you like to share with us?
Yeah, well, just I'm really honored to be part of this an intellectual community that spans universities and outside of universities. I think it's really important for conversations to keep going. I really do support what Imam Talud has said. I would just say, yeah, I did make, that my publisher, the UNC Press, I'll share the book cover right now, Realizing
Inshallah.
Islam, the Tijaniyya North African 18th Century Muslim World, is available for free download, PDF. That's supported by a Mellon Foundation grant that the publisher, University of North Carolina Press, got. And I think the tune is about $7,000. So I just want to make the point that that's probably what a publisher goes in for to publish each one of these books. Right? I'm not a publisher myself, but um, so that's not going to be made back, we'd be barely made back if they sell out all of the print run, right? So you really, I think it is. I consider my own obligation. If there's a book that somebody has published that's relevant to me, that I buy that book, because it's something that if the larger community does not do it and is just looking for pirated PDFs online, then the work can't go on, right? It can't be produced, and scholars can't be. I'm lucky. I'm in a university, so I don't. I have a job that I don't that allows me to write and to research, and I don't have to. I don't make money from publishing books, but for the most people who do write in this way, that's their income. And yeah, so yeah, thanks anyway for all of you guys. I'm preaching to the choir, of course, but all of you guys that support us and that part of this conversation, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shaykh Zachary, for sharing with us, and also may Allah preserve you. I think before I end, I'd like to make a one announcement about the hospital project, humanitarian project, run by Sheikh Mahi under Alfiatano. We like you to urge you, those who are watching, if you like to contribute in any amount. We have been doing this for 3 years. The hospital is for humanity purpose and humanitarian. It's a humanitarian project and purpose. It's been ongoing for 3 years, as I mentioned, and it's been aims at Taibanias. So if you're interested, is under launchgood bit.ly/Senegal Hospital, or you can go to Sawilahi Facebook or IG. I repeat again, is at the launchgood. You can donate at any amount or contribute at any amount. Is at bit.ly/Senegal Hospital. All right. Before we end this and closing up, um, can either Shaykh Zachary Wright or Imam Talut make the closing doa?
Yeah.
Bismillah.
Sidi Zakaria, Bismillah.
Well, we just want to thank Allah. We thank the creation for helping us in this endeavor. We're just gonna recite Salat al-Fatih. Imam, you have to recite with me. Also, see Ibrahim and Khalid. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره
حق
ومقداره
قدره
العظيم.
With this, we like to say thank you to all of you. May Allah preserve all of you. We hope to see all of you again on our live, inshallah. And remember us in your prayer. And we say, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Inshallah. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, that was a very interesting and beneficial uh, session that we had. It's actually our podcast, but we make it live on Shaykh Ahmad Tijani and the Tijaniyya Sufi order. So much to learn, mashallah. May Allah bless our guests. I'd just like to update you for this Saturday and Sunday. We'll be having the Blessed Tree screening again. On this Saturday, we have it at 15 August. 10 p.m. and on Sunday, 16 August or 9 a.m. This is to ensure that people around the globe, wherever you are, able to watch this beautiful documentary. And on Sunday, inshallah, our tafsir Quran Shaykh Ibrahim Nas with Imam Abdul will continue, inshallah. And with this, we say good night, good evening, good morning, and good times for all of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our ibadah and tawbah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.